This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning, and welcome to our Collaborative on Health and the Environment Alaska teleconference. Today we will be discussing environmental exposures and autism, the interplay between genes, environment, and health status, with Dr. Martha Herbert of Harvard Medical School and Maureen Swanson of Learning Disabilities Association of America. My name is Diana DeFazio, and on behalf of Alaska Community Action on Toxics, I'll be facilitating today's call. CHE Alaska is a regional partnership group of the National Collaborative on Health and the Environment. CHE Alaska aims to advance knowledge and effective action to address growing concerns about the links between human health and environmental factors. You can find more information on the following websites: healthandenvironment.org, and that's spelled out healthandenvironment.org, and akaction.org. And today's call will last 1 hour. Everyone who signed up for the call should have received an email this morning with a link to the call webpage where you will find speaker presentations. And today, both of our speakers do have presentation slides. If you didn't receive the link, you can go to the Alaska Community Action on Toxics homepage at akaction.org. Just click on the title of today's call, which is in the upper left of the homepage, and this will bring you to the call webpage. Now it is my pleasure to welcome and introduce Dr. Martha Herbert. Dr. Herbert is an assistant professor of neurology at Harvard Medical School, a pediatric neurologist at the Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, and an affiliate of the Harvard MIT MGH Martinos Center for Biomedical Imaging, where she is director of the Transcend Research Program, and that stands for Treatment Research and Neuroscience Evaluation of Neurodevelopmental Disorders. Dr. Herbert earned her medical degree at the Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons. Prior to her medical training, she obtained a doctoral degree at the University of California, Santa Cruz, studying evolution and development of learning processes in biology and culture in the History of Consciousness program, and then did postdoctoral work in the philosophy and history of science. Dr. Herbert trained in pediatrics at Cornell University Medical Center and in neurology and child neurology at the Massachusetts General Hospital, where she has remained. She received the first Cure Autism Now Innovator Award and is now on the Scientific Advisory Committee of Autism Speaks. Her background in pediatric neurology, evolutionary biology, and history of science has oriented her towards systems biology, brain connectivity and dynamism, and brain-body interrelationships. Dr. Herbert is also author of The Autism Revolution, Whole Body Strategies for Making Life All It Can Be. And we're very honored to have you with us today, Dr. Herbert. Would you like to go ahead and begin?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. So I'm going to be talking from slides that are on the website in PDF format, and when I move from one to the next, I'll say next slide. And I'm using the title of Environmental Exposures and Autism, the interplay between genes and environment and health status. And I've added health status because I don't think that saying gene-environment interaction tells the whole story. In fact, I think it misses the real locus where the rubber hits the road, which is how our physiology is changed by environmental impacts, how it's vulnerable based on our genes, and how the environment changes not only gene expression, but our health. And that's where the problems come from. So that's my title slide. I'm going now to the next slide. When I came into the field of autism, the model that we had of explaining it was very much like a Lego model. There are a set of genes affecting a set of discrete brain regions, creating specific behaviors. So the research agenda was by and large oriented toward identifying the genes, and at that time we thought there were going to be between 3 and 8, or then it was maybe 12 genes, and looking for brain regions. The belief system was it's determined before birth, fixed for life, and that there's nothing you can do about it other than ameliorative adaptive intervention. Next slide. However, there's a new model which I took the liberty of calling an Autism Revolution, because that's the name of my book, but really it is an Autism Revolution whether or not I wrote the book. And I think what we're seeing is a move from the idea of a genetic caused brain impairment to an environmental and medical obstruction of brain function. And the reason for this is that the data the kind of data we have is moving in a lot of directions we would never have predicted. Whereas 15 years ago, people were talking about 3 to 8 genes. Now we have hundreds and hundreds of genes, going on 1,000, most of modest impact. The numbers are not stable, but they're going up, and there's growing evidence for environmental factors being implicated. It's not just brain, but the whole body is implicated, and there's environmentally vulnerable physiology, genes that set us up for having trouble with processing and eliminating environmental exposures, and other kinds of vulnerabilities too, immune, energy production, so forth. It's not just brain modules, but whole brain involvement, and it's not just information processing, but there's evidence of inflammation and oxidative stress and mitochondrial dysfunction in the brain. And it's not necessarily hardwired, because human beings, a certain portion, young children and even older people, have lost their diagnoses, and in a growing number of mouse models, there's been a reversal as well. Next slide. I'm on slide 4. So the older model was genes, brains, and behavior, and drugs would be used to intervene at brain, and behavioral therapy would be used to intervene at the level of behaviors. Next slide. But what I want to talk with you about is a whole body systems model, and I'm giving you the whole picture here, but if we're doing this from PowerPoint, this would be animated. So what you have is not just genes, but also the physical and biological environment and the psychosocial environment. And these all converge on cells and lead to cellular dysfunction with problems in energy production, cellular and molecular signaling, and metabolism. This impacts the brain, and you get the behaviors that, until the recent revision of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the core features of autism were communication, social interaction, and restricted behaviors. The brain is also implicated in the sensory, sleep, and seizure features of autism. But cellular dysfunction affects the body as well. The body contributes to sensory, sleep, and seizure problems, and it also is involved in the gastrointestinal, immune, and hormonal and other problems in the body. People with an autism diagnosis who have problems across all of these levels will be much more easily frustrated, more easily overwhelmed, and will experience pain, poor function, and sickness. And all of this leads to overload and stress for the individuals affected, and I might add for their families as well. And in the setting of overload and stress, you get into a vicious circle, because that makes the cellular dysfunction worse. So everything makes everything else worse. And what I'm going to be driving at also is, how do you reverse and go from vicious circles where everything makes everything else worse to going to virtuous circles where things make other things better. But the point I'm trying to make here is in this iceberg slide, the next slide, slide number 6, that autism symptoms emerge from problems with underlying functions. The behaviors that we use to define autism are the tip of the iceberg. Underlying that are a whole range of systemic functional disturbances, and they create a system that's operating more differently and with difficulty. And what we see at the social level is behaviors, but it's just not the whole story. Next slide. I wrote a paper in 2010 on environmentally vulnerable physiology, because I was asked to write a paper on environmental exposures, and I said, yes, that's really important, but the rubber hits the road in the way these exposures interact with our physiology, and we do have some power to affect our physiology. This paper is posted on my website, www.marthaherbert.org, under publications. A new paper that I wrote is a part of a book that's just come out called Genetic Explanations, Sense and Nonsense. My chapter, chapter 10, is called From Static Genetic Brain Defect to Dynamic Gene Environmented Modulated Pathophysiology. But honestly, I recommend the whole book. It's very rich with ways of expanding your understanding of genes and understanding why we need to go beyond genes. Of course, there are genes and they have impacts, but there's more than that. Next slide. And I also want to call to your attention my website, autismwhyandhow.org, where I review the multiple different models that people use when they answer the 3 questions on the slide. What is autism? How is autism caused? And how can we help? And I want to point out the difference between saying what causes autism and how is autism caused. What causes autism would be to point to a list of substances or other exposures that would be causes. How is autism caused would be how do these things actually change the system so the system produces autistic behaviors. It's a process question. And I think it's a more productive question scientifically. Next slide, slide 10. I want to talk about a chemical called glutathione. It's in our bodies. It's a vital chemical for detoxification, and it's the body's and brain's most potent antioxidant. It's often low in autism spectrum disorders, or ASD, and in a host of other chronic conditions, including cancer, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and much more. It's amazing how little we know about it since it's so fundamental to our well-being, or if it's depleted, to our vulnerability. It's made in the liver from 3 amino acids, and it has 2 forms. The active form, which is in chemical lingo, reduced glutathione, or GSH, which you'll hear more about in a moment, or oxidized glutathione, GSSG. Next slide, slide 11. Here's just a little bit of the growing body of data. On the left, you see that people with autism have less GSH than controls. And on the right, you see brain imaging, where healthy volunteers have more glutathione than major depressive disorder, and major depressive disorder has more glutathione than chronic fatigue. Chronic fatigue has many metabolic similarities with autism spectrum disorder. So let's go to the next slide, slide 12. What is the vulnerability when your GSH is low? And the GSH, when it's low, changes the ratio of GSH, which is the active form, to GSSG, the reduced form. If you have a good, healthy ratio, if you're exposed to a toxic insult, it causes problems, but you can protect yourself and bounce back. But if you're fragile and your GSH reserves are depleted and limited, when you have a toxic insult, you go below the toxic threshold, and it's harder to pull back. And at some point, people can reach a tipping point in their metabolism where they have a harder time coming back. And I don't particularly have time to talk about it on this slideshow and this discussion, but I do want to propose that that tipping point has to do with the way autism regression might happen, at least in many cases. And this has not been studied. Well, we are studying it in a prospective infant study, but I don't know other people who are studying it. Next slide, slide 13. It's important to understand that glutathione is a final common pathway. And why is that? Glutathione is depleted by thousands of toxins, by oxidative stress, which is a consequence of having more exposure than protection, of infection, it's depleted by infection, by inflammation, by electromagnetic exposures, by nutrient-poor diet. The result of this is that small exposures of any one thing can still add up to a substantial depletion of your antioxidant resilience, because so many of these things at any rate target the same thing. So even little bits of this and little bits of that add up to a big problem. And I give you a citation here from Lee et al. Hypothesis, underlying a unifying mechanism for nutrition and chemicals as lifelong modulators of DNA hypomethylation. And DNA hypomethylation changes gene expression and makes you vulnerable. So what I'm arguing is that sometimes epidemiological studies looking for what causes autism may not be sensitive, not because there's no problem, but because there are so many problems that no one of them rises to the top statistically in a study that just looks at cause and not at the changes to our physiology. Next slide, slide 14. Another part of our physiology that's very vulnerable to environmental influences is our mitochondria. Mitochondria are the energy powerhouses inside our cells. They are highly vulnerable in their biochemistry because toxicants and oxidative stress can interfere with the chemical assembly lines that are part of their functioning. They also have lipid membranes, which are very vulnerable. Membrane damage both causes and results from mitochondrial dysfunction. Mitochondria are exquisite structural and functional entities, and their structural and functional characteristics provide a number of primary targets for toxicant-induced bioenergetic failure. So mitochondria are another vital common pathway for many different kinds of problems, and there are easily 5,000 to 6,000 articles in PubMed with the term mitochondrial dysfunction in the medical literature about an abundance of very common medical diseases, making you wonder how much these common diseases have an environmental contributor that you need to look at from a physiological point of view. Next slide, slide 15. And here is an example of mitochondrial, a slide listing a host of seemingly unrelated disorders related to mitochondrial dysfunction, and I won't take our time to read every last one of these, but you can see that it's a vast array of conditions, and they all result in mitochondrial dysfunction, and they may all be able to benefit from intelligent applications of antioxidant therapies. The article commented, diets deficient in micronutrients, such as antioxidants and other things that facilitate them, like minerals and phytonutrients, can accelerate mitochondrial decay and contribute to neurodegeneration. And I would say to contribute to autism as part of that. Next slide, slide 16. Metabolic findings have been examined in parents of children with autism. This is a paper showing data about how a group of 86 parents differ from 200 controls, parents of 200 control subjects, by having higher homocysteine, higher SAH, lower active glutathione or reduced glutathione, and increased oxidized glutathione. And all of these are markers of oxidative stress and inflammation, which are potentially outcomes of environmental insults. Very interestingly, in a review, now I'm on slide 17, I advanced. In a review of genome-wide expression studies, not only in autism, but in Rett and Downs, where we know what the primary genetic contributor is, unlike in autism, the investigators did not find that developmental genes were primary in these conditions. Instead, and I've highlighted in red, a dysregulated immune response accompanied by enhanced oxidative stress and abnormal mitochondrial metabolism seemingly represents the common molecular underpinning of these neurodevelopmental disorders. And a study earlier this year, with Isaac Cohane, who's head of the Countway Library at Harvard Medical School as a key author, also identified changes in immune gene expression as the biggest cluster in gene expression changes in autism spectrum disorders. Next slide, slide 18. So environment and brain tissue vulnerability. Many environmental exposures can contribute to inflammation, to reduction in brain perfusion, and to compromise of the blood-brain barrier. Next slide, slide 19. This is just a little bit on the blood-brain barrier and how vulnerable it is. We think of it as something that protects the brain from the environment, but it only protects it to a certain degree and only when it's intact. High blood pressure, too much osmolality in the brain, microwaves, radiation, infection, inflammation, activated mast cells from the gut, insufficient oxygen, injury, trauma, pressure, and deficient vitamin C or flavonoids can all contribute to permeability of the blood-brain barrier. Next slide, slide 20. So what does this, I want to explain to you what I'm going to get a little technical here about brain research, and this is a review of some older brain research. In my own work with the column on the left, we demonstrated that people were finding that brains are larger in autism. We found that they're not larger because of more neurons, which would be the gray pie, slice of the pie, but it was really white matter, and nobody had really thought that much about white matter. White matter, furthermore, didn't increase uniformly, but in the outer part of the white matter, and that part of the white matter doesn't really develop until after birth. The sequence of myelination of white matter is in the central column in slide 20, where it starts out deep in the brain, getting myelinated, and as the infant, after birth, gets older, after the 9th month, it starts getting out into the area where we found that it was bigger. The column on the right shows a different study from Joe Piven's group and Heather Cody Hazlitt in North Carolina, where if you measure head circumferences in babies, the babies' heads don't start getting bigger until around the 9th to 12th month. And that may be coincidentally or causally, we don't know yet, related to the pattern of myelination in the brain. So since these findings emerged, I've considered my own charge in my research to be to answer the question, what do we need to learn about the brain and about autism to understand the data on this slide? Next slide, slide 21. One of the pivotal discoveries in my own development was the 2005 paper Vargas et al. With senior author Carlos Pardo showing inflammation in the brain, specifically neuroglial activation and neuroinflammation. So the brown dots you see in these slides are immune cells or immune-related cells. Glial cells are not, astrocytes and microglial cells are activated here, and microglial cells are immune-related in origin. Astrocytes are brain cells, but they get involved in immune responses. So these changes were found to be similar in intensity in brains from 5 to 44 that were investigated. In other words, it didn't get worse or better during that time period. It was a chronic problem. But a 3-year-old with autism, rigorously diagnosed, who died, the child's brain was examined and found to have much more inflammation. So there's a possibility of a larger amount of inflammation that tapers off but remains chronic rather than going away. Next slide, slide 22. When my paper showing white matter enlargement in the outer white matter using MRI scans in living individuals came out, Dr. Pardo went back to his brain tissue samples to see if there was more inflammation in the outer white matter than in the deeper white matter. And he found that this was so for the astroglial cells, but not for the microglial cells. Next slide, slide 23. Now, the immune responses that have been identified in a growing number of brain research studies, tissue studies, starting with Dr. Pardo's, are quite similar to the brain changes listed on slide 23 that are triggered by exposures to air pollution. Inflammation in the brain is a final common pathway from many different kinds of exposures. And it should be also noted that there are now at least 3 studies linking air pollution to autism. We all know that air pollution is a mix of many different substances, so this doesn't prove that any one substance is the cause. And also the studies showing that there's more autism closer to exposures to air pollution did not involve studies of brain tissue. So these are just being put together as a suggestion that they may be related, but they are not. That relationship has not been studied in brain tissue to autism. To autism, although neuroinflammation has been documented in brain tissue in studies of children from Mexico City compared to children from Montana by the second author in this slide, Calderon-Gardysueñas. Next slide. This is a very important slide, slide 24. This is where I want to really drive home to you that it's not enough to say that there's been exposures, and it's not enough to say that there's been inflammation, because you really need to ask the question, how do we get from these cellular and chemical changes to what we see as autistic behaviors? So in this slide, which isn't even from a paper on autism, but basically the chemistry is the same, we're looking, I'll walk you through it. First of all, there's a blood vessel across the top, and you see the red cells and the white cells, which are painted blue. You see a breach in the blood-brain barrier where it says peripheral inflammatory response. The smaller, lumpy microglial cell swells up into an activated microglial cell. And the green cell is an astrocyte, which is puffier than it would be if it weren't activated. Note that going upward from the green cell are these feet, and the blood vessels are wrapped in the brain by these feet from astrocytes as well as some other things. And when these astrocytes swell up, they can constrict that blood vessel. A foot coming down from the astrocyte is going to the synapse, and you see the space between the 2 nerve cells filled with yellow dots, which is glutamate. Normally, if the astrocyte were not distracted by being activated, it would mop up that glutamate and let the system calm down, because glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter. But when the astrocyte is activated, the normal housekeeping functions get neglected and the glutamate piles up. All of this leads to chronic inflammation, which is irritating, and it promotes excitotoxicity, a chronic state of too much cellular excitation. If this goes on long enough, it can cause damage. So what does this do to the way the brain functions? I will say a little bit about that. There's a lot more to be said about that in some of the slideshows I have posted on autismrevolution.org that you can look at. Next slide, slide 25. The point I'm trying to make is that environmental stressors are contributing to an ongoing chronic degradation of brain and body function. Too much excitation or not enough inhibition changes the ratio so that you have an increased ratio. That leads to more irritability, hypersensitivity, and overload. That can lead to problems sleeping, to too much sensory reactivity, but it also reduces the information complexity and organization of the brain. And for those of you with any kind of engineering background or even casual familiarity, you get a reduced signal-to-noise ratio, which basically means in everyday language increased chaos and confusion and less information. This excitation-inhibition ratio can be increased by inflammation, oxidative stress, and many toxicants, as well as by genetic dysfunction. Next slide. So also mitochondrial dysfunction is important in degrading the quality of function of synapses between neurons. Neurons impacted by metabolic dysfunction and reduced efficiency of energy production, which is a consequence of environmental exposure, can have the function, the energy to stay alive, but they may not always have enough energy to fire electrical signals. So in autism, we see reduced connectivity from one part of the brain to another, and one contribution could be mitochondrial dysfunction. But honestly, most of the people who are studying that think it's genetic and are not looking for the traces of environmental impact in the brain, though I think they should be, and I'm working on it. Here is a slide which I'll walk you through, comparing children with autism to children without autism in terms of connections from one part of the brain, this is slide 27, to another part of the brain. And you see in the 5 to 8-year-olds, on the left, there are a bunch of lines, but on the right, there's a ton of lines. And each of those lines, if it's black, represents less connection between one part of the brain and the other. We had two types of exposures, sensory exposures. One of them was just the Star Saver screensaver from Microsoft, and the other was a much more complex, edited version of the Disney film Fantasia. That really overwhelmed the 5 to 8-year-olds with autism, and they could not keep up with the rate of processing that was going on in the brains of the control children. And that's where all those black lines came from. But in the 9 to 11-year-olds, it was much less of a problem. So the older kids could tolerate stimulation with less loss of coordination. And I would like to think that if we have effective treatments for autism, we would get the same impact. Next slide, slide 28. I want to introduce to you a metaphor. The metaphor is that the tissue pathophysiology, the cellular inflammation and oxidative stress problems that come from too much exposures reduces brain bandwidth. So you only have a few bars on the phone and you can't really hear what the other person is talking about. But more bandwidth gives you good reception and you just think about the conversation and not about the noise. Next slide. So this is basically the same thing. With less signal and more noise, you get less bandwidth. And with more signal and less noise, you get more bandwidth. When you have more bandwidth, you have more spontaneous learning. When you have less bandwidth, you have to drill over and over again, and you don't seem to make progress. Next slide. So this is an important slide. It's a summary slide. What I'm saying, it's slide 30, but the number's not on the slide itself. What I'm offering you is a different model of autism, where autism is an emergent property of a system with altered parameters and challenged, struggling physiology, so that autism is not just a developmental disorder that's hardwired into the brain before you're born, but autism is created moment by moment by how the cells in the brain function. The cells of the brain function differently depending on their health, and the health of brain cells depends on the health of the whole body and on the health of the earth. Next slide, slide 31. Here's an amazing story. There are a bunch of studies, which I didn't summarize here due to time constraints, about reversing autism-like symptoms in mouse models. Most of them targeted neuron function. In this slide, they put in a bone marrow transplant of microglia and created increased lifespan, normalized breathing, increased body weight, and improved locomotor activity that lasted for a year without even targeting the neurons. It turns out that the function, the phagocytes, the microglia were playing, that was doing the job of improving things, was not molecularly specific, but was taking out the trash. Now, hang on to that. We'll get back to that. Next slide, slide 32. Based on this idea of taking out the trash in the brain being important, and that Mickey Ashner, a neurotoxicologist at Vanderbilt, used the phrase of astrocytes as glia and glia as garbage collectors, I one day Googled glia as garbage collectors and found this remarkable picture. On the left, you see glial cells chowing down debris that is found in brains with neurodegenerative disease. In the middle picture, you see an astrocyte sidling up to a blood vessel. The kind of gap on the left lower part of the middle piece is a blood vessel. And on the one on the right the cell is dumping the garbage into the blood vessel. Imagine that. You are watching trash collection in the brain. The way they made this happen was to nutritionally activate the rodents whose brains they then studied in this fashion. Next slide. So this is my hypothesis regarding autistic regression, which is that, and I'm just going to have to rush through it. It's spelled out better in my book in chapter 5. Too much allostatic load, which is the total accumulation of stress, plus genetic and environmental weak points, oxidative stress and inflammation. The cells become hypersensitive and overreactive. The tipping point is reached. The brain's glial cells poop out and don't keep up their housekeeping functions. Brain energy production gets less efficient. Networks get weaker. Weaker brain networks produce weaker interactions with the world, and this produces behaviors we call autistic. And I will have to, unfortunately, rush on, but let me go on and ask, why does garbage pile up? Very simple. Too much bad stuff, toxicants that actively interfere with cellular processes, and these cellular processes can be during the development of the brain and also during the rest of your life. And molecular debris that piles up because there's cellular stress and inflammation. Not enough good stuff. You need nutrients to run cleanup operations and keep things working. And you need blood flow to carry out the trash. And if blood flow is constricted or the blood is sticky from being sick, having poor nutrition, inflammation, or oxidative stress, you'll have problems taking out the trash. Slide, next slide. Just a second here. Slide 35. The brain needs energy and nutrition supplies. You need abundant supplies to protect the brain from being dragged down and to take out the garbage. Better brain health will restore the brain's pull powers, and we can support brain health through an environmental support intervention, such as nutrient flooding, a high nutrient density diet, so the brain can pick and choose what it needs based on the demands of the day. What we want to do is build resiliency and reduce allostatic or total load. And resiliency is the total set of strengths, adaptation skills, cell health, nutritional fortitude, exercise, community, and more, while total load is the total buildup of noxious stressors, noxious exposures, stressors, and deficiencies. Building resiliency protects the brain from debilitating impacts of the tissue, pathophysiology, the inflammation, and so forth. Next slide. So here's a summary. There are going to be 3 slides in a row with this diagram, each showing a different stage. Here you see that noxious, toxic, and other exposures create body cell health problems, which relate to brain cell health problems. With brain cell health problems, you get brain function glitches, stress, and overwhelm, and challenging behaviors, and this is a vicious circle. In slide 38, you can see just emphasizing the same thing, that in this situation, when there are problems in each level, adding problems to any level makes the whole thing worse. But in slide 39, here's the idea that healthy exposures can improve cell health in the brain and in the body. The brain will function better. There will be less stress, more bandwidth, and better learning and better behavior. So this is environmental as well as healthy exposures. And what you're doing is building resiliency to create virtuous cycles. So in slide 40, I'm making the proposition and the assertion that we know enough now to promote health and to hunt for and remove contributors to harm, and that we are already positioned to take on autism and other conditions as public health programs. I just want to run quickly through a wonderful slide, which is about dietary agents for the prevention and therapy of cancer. Actually, there's a lot of metabolic similarities, unfortunately, between cancer and autism, and concern that as people with autism age, they may be more vulnerable to cancer, and some data is starting to accumulate for that. In the next slide, slide 42, you see dietary agents with anti-cancer properties, all these wonderful foods that actually, and move to the next slide, slide 42, are sophisticated means of targeting critical components of pathways that when they're working well can keep you healthy, and when they're strained can lead you into harm's way in all kinds of disease processes. Next slide, slide 43. So I'm moving into my last 3 slides here. Recipe for improvement. 2 basic principles: maximize what's good, build resilience through optimal nutrition, high nutrient density food, activity, balance, optimal information process, keeping input, and keeping gut bugs healthy. Reduce total load and eliminate drag by reducing toxic exposures and allergens, getting enough sleep, which is huge, plenty of exercise, not only exercise, but movement that improves your awareness of and coordination, and avoiding and reducing infection. Slide 45. So a recipe for improvement is to avoid poor bandwidth and lots of chaos, which is produced by poor food with few nutrients and many allergens, which is produced by lots of toxins and infectious issues, and which is produced by lots of stress, pressure, too much, and with too much too fast. And to build good bandwidth and rich organization through excellent food of high nutrient density with minimal allergens, to minimize toxic and infectious burden, and through love, learning, respect, through sensitive, balanced sensory input, and through savoring and treasuring each moment rather than rushing. Next slide and final slide. So these are 10 tips from my book, Autism Revolution. People go for the extraordinary. People with autism can be quite extraordinary. They don't have to be, quote, normal or typical to be extraordinary. Know what you can control. The genetic code is what it is, but you can influence environment and gene expression. Repair and support cells and cycles. Get gut and immune systems on your side. Build better brain health, as I described. Calm brain chaos. Join your child's world. Love, rejoice, and make breakthroughs. Lead the revolution, and do all this for yourself, your next baby, your family, and your world. So that concludes my slideshow, and thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Herbert, for your excellent presentation and for giving us so many perspectives to think about. I'm sure that there are questions out there, and we hope to have time at the very end to take some questions. Now I'd like to welcome and introduce Maureen Swanson. Maureen is Director of the Healthy Children Project of the Learning Disabilities Association of America, or LDA, focused on raising awareness of environmental factors linked to learning and developmental disabilities, and on promoting policies and practices to reduce toxic chemical exposures, especially for pregnant women and children. She represents LDA in the Safer Chemicals Healthy Families campaign, a national coalition of health, environmental, and parent groups, along with businesses, working to promote safer chemical policies. And she is also co-chair of Safer Chemicals Healthy Families Health Work Group. Maureen has testified before Congress on behalf of LDA on the need to revise the Toxic Substances Control Act to better protect children's health. And prior to her position with LDA, Maureen was a senior policy analyst with the Minnesota Office of Environmental Assistance. She holds a master's degree from Indiana University's School of Public and Environmental Affairs and a bachelor's degree from Bucknell University. And welcome, Maureen. Would you like to go ahead and begin?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Diana, and thank you to Alaska Community Action, who continues to do such important and great work, advocacy and informing people. So I think my part of today's webinar is to focus on what we can take of all that amazing and excellent information that Dr. Herbert is providing, and it's very complex, and that's a lot of it's emerging science. And how do we take this information, this revolution in thinking on autism, and inform policymakers about that? And how should this information, this new science, inform congressional efforts to revise and improve our chemical laws, and especially right now, the Toxic Substances Control Act? And how should it inform EPA's work to hone in on chemicals of greatest concern? So that is what I try to help LDA and other partner neurodevelopmental organizations do, and then more broadly, the health and environmental organizations that are part of Safer Chemicals Healthy Families. And I should mention that LDA works with the ARC of the United States and its affiliates, such as the ARC of Anchorage, and the Autism Society and Autism Speaks are just a few of our partners, health partners in this effort. So in 2002, this is slide 2, in 2002, the National Academy of Sciences issued a report saying that toxic environmental exposures directly cause 3% of learning and developmental disabilities. And I use the term learning and developmental disabilities to include autism, but when I or when one of you is speaking specifically about autism, then you can substitute or understand that autism is a big part of learning and developmental disabilities. And the National Academy of Sciences also said that environmental factors interacting with genetics contribute to another 25% of learning and developmental disabilities. So that's pretty astounding. You know, that's 28% of learning and developmental disabilities as a conservative estimate that are coming about, at least in part, because of environmental factors. So then 10 years later, 2012, an editorial came out in Environmental Health Perspectives. This is slide 3. The editorial by Dr. Birnbaum, who's director of the National Institute on Environmental Health and Science, Drs. Landrigan and Lambertini of Mount Sinai School of Medicine. And the editorial or the article was titled, "A Research Strategy to Discover the Environmental Causes of Autism and Neurodevelopmental Disabilities." So in 2002, we have this statement from the National Academy of Sciences, and a decade later, thanks to many scientists' ongoing work and physicians' ongoing work, we're starting to name these chemicals that are most probably linked with causing neurodevelopmental harm. And so their article, if you'll go to the next slide, slide 4, their article listed the top 10 chemicals and categories of chemicals already suspected of causing developmental neurotoxicity, or in other words, harming brain development. And you'll see a lot of familiar chemicals on there. If you'd like to know more about the specific chemicals, a good website to start with is saferchemicals.org, www.saferchemicals.org. And down at the bottom of the homepage, click on Health Report, and then on Learning and Developmental Disabilities. And we just provide a little bit of description of each of those chemical categories. So of those chemicals listed there, lead, methylmercury, PCBs, some of the endocrine disrupting chemicals, which include chemicals like bisphenol A and phthalates that are both widely used in plastics. The PCBs are also endocrine disrupting chemicals. The brominated flame retardants are endocrine disruptors. So that endocrine disruptor category includes some of these others that are listed specifically. The polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, those are chemicals that are air pollutants from fuel combustion in vehicles and coal-fired power plants, heating and cooking. The brominated flame retardants are in, as you've probably all heard, are in couches and upholstery. They're in the nap mats that children use in preschools and daycare centers. They're in carpets. They're in they're in a whole slew of products. And Alaska Community Action has a good, or highlights a recent findings on brominated flame retardants in nap mats on their homepage. And then the perfluorinated compounds are used in stain-resistant and non-stick products, such as the cookware, or again, stain-resistant upholstery and carpeting. So of these chemicals, lead, mercury, the PCBs, some of the endocrine disruptors, the brominated flame retardants, and the perfluorinated compounds are all fall under the Toxic Substances Control Act, and we'll get into that more in a minute. Those are all covered by the Act. In fact, PCBs were actually banned from most uses with the Act. In 1976, when the Toxic Substances Control Act was adopted, it included a provision that banned PCBs. And that was one of the last things it ever did well. So next slide, please. So we've got these chemicals that are, now we've got the science and the understanding to start to hone in on these chemicals that are replete in our environment and our bodies and our products. And so now that we have those chemicals starting to be named and more thoroughly understood, how do we relate that to our understanding of autism? And as you heard Dr. Herbert go into a lot of the details and complexities on that. So this slide is a much more simplistic, in some ways, look at that. And it's toxic chemicals interacting with genetics. And so there's research going on many different places in the country on the interaction of genetic and environmental factors. There's the early study, which has, I think, 4 different study centers, one at Johns Hopkins and one at Drexel in Pennsylvania. I think there's one in California. The SEED study, and then Autism Speaks this month is holding a symposium on environmental epigenetics and autism. So there's a lot of amazing work going on all over the country to try and uncover and pinpoint some of these environmental factors and how they're interacting with our genetics to result in autism. There's evidence from a California study of twins and autism. This was a seminal study, and it to my understanding, it kind of turned a lot of mainstream autism thinking on its head because it found, basically what it found is that there's a much higher percentage of environmental risk factors in the development of autism in twins than previously understood. For decades, the thinking was that most of the risk factors were genetic. And now with this study, again, you're seeing that shift that Dr. Herbert spoke about, where they found that 58% of risk factors are environmental. And now environmental here doesn't just mean toxins. It also means the age of the parents and smoking and a much broader understanding of environment. And then finally, you'll see we are seeing that the thinking on autism and the understanding that there are environmental contributors is really going from an alternative way of thinking much more into the mainstream. Dr. Danielle Fallon, who heads the early study at Johns Hopkins University, was one of the speakers at a briefing for Senate staffers last fall that LDA held in Washington. And she is a genetics epidemiologist, and she said that, that her own thinking coming into her work and her own training was to really just look at genetics almost exclusively in autism. And now, as a result of her research and of others' research and of the early study, she said that her thinking has completely changed to understanding and believing that there's a lot of environmental contributors interacting with the genetics. And she said that, those two separate camps of genetics and environment are starting to come together. I'll be quicker here. I see we're short on time. So the next slide, how do we talk about chemicals in brain development when we talk to the public or to policymakers? And we start with learning and developmental disabilities affect 1 in 6 American children, and that autism and ADHD are increasing rapidly. That mounting scientific evidence shows that toxic chemicals interacting with genetics can harm brain development, and that these chemicals are in our everyday products, they're in our bodies, they're in our homes and schools and workplaces. And then usually we provide a few examples to make it real for people. So you're not just saying toxins or chemicals, you're saying the flame retardants in your couch or the nonstick chemicals in your pots and pans. And that the developing fetus, babies, and young children are especially at risk of harm from toxic chemical exposures, even at very, very low levels. And I should have said that the early study and the seed study, those are studies that are looking at environmental and genetic factors implicated in autism at the prenatal and early infant stages of development. Next slide. So when we talk about the Toxic Substances Control Act, it is our nation's law that is supposed to regulate more than 80,000 chemicals that are used in products and materials. It does not cover pesticides. That's a different law. And TSCA requires, there is no requirement in TSCA, unbelievably, there's no requirement to show that chemicals are safe to human health before they go on the market. 20 years ago, EPA tried to ban asbestos after a decade of research and millions of dollars, and what should have been an easy ban, given all the evidence and that asbestos, causes cancer. EPA could not get asbestos banned under TSCA, and they kind of gave up after that in terms of trying to get chemicals banned under that law. And even the chemical industry admits that TSCA needs to be revised. Now, I think that can be a ruse sometimes. They've gotten the chemical industry's gotten a lot of play out of saying that TSCA needs to be revised and we need to reform the Toxic Substances Control Act, but they have not been helpful in coming forward with real ways to make that happen. So what do we want? On the next slide, we want a federal law. We need a federal law that requires testing of all chemicals to show safety as a condition for entering or remaining in use. We need quick action to replace the worst chemicals with safer alternatives. And we need a safety standard that would especially protect the most vulnerable, including pregnant women and children. Next slide. And this, I'll very quickly just say that just about all of our major medical associations are calling for reform of this broken and failed law, including the American Medical Association, the American Nurses Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the National Medical Association, which is African American physicians, and the American Public Health Association. So next slide. So what we have we have an introduction in 2011. Senator Lautenberg introduced the Safe Chemicals Act, and the Safe Chemicals Act would do those things that I outlined that we need to have happen. It would require testing of all chemicals. It would require that EPA act swiftly on the worst chemicals, the chemicals that we already know contribute to problems with brain development, that are carcinogens, that cause reproductive harm, and that the Safe Chemicals Act would be protective, especially of pregnant women and children. Next slide. So last July, the Safe Chemicals Act, TSCA hasn't been revised since 1976. It's the only major environmental statute that has never been revised. And for the first time ever, thanks to a lot of work from a lot of different organizations, including Alaska Community Action, the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee passed the Safe Chemicals Act out of committee and on to a full Senate vote. There were some major changes made to the act in terms of I won't go into the prioritization process, some major changes on how new chemicals would be assessed and on protecting confidential business information. And then the Senate in the fall and into the last weeks of 2012 did not hold a floor vote on the act. Next slide. So what now? Senator Lautenberg is expected to reintroduce the Safe Chemicals Act this spring. There could be other bills as well. There's a possibility that Senator Vitter of Louisiana would introduce his own version of reform. There is a renewed push for co-sponsors of Senator Lautenberg's Safe Chemicals Act and a renewed push for Republican co-sponsors. And I've got to say that Senator Murkowski is one of the Republican senators who I know many of you on the phone have worked closely with and made sure that she understands the concerns and reasons that we need to have chemicals tested to protect public health. Next slide. Going quickly. And the last two slides just come back to why our voices are so essential. Why do the learning and developmental disabilities voices matter? Why do we need to hear, why do our policymakers need to hear from the autism community? And that's because concern over threats to brain development and learning are a very compelling message, and they're even more compelling given the new science and the mounting science that on toxic chemicals contributing to autism. Protecting the developing fetus and children is a compelling message. Legislators often have not heard from the autism community about chemicals. So this is a fresh perspective, and there are still a lot of policymakers who need to hear from us that we want the Safe Chemicals Act enacted or adopted in order to protect our children's brains and bodies, and that health groups, nurses, and parents have a very high degree of integrity. We're not in this to profit the way the chemical makers are. We're in this to protect our kids.
Maureen,
so I'll end with key policy messages, and that is that we can't protect children from toxic chemical exposures by ourselves. There's no way. We need Congress to stand against the chemical lobby and protect our kids from toxic chemicals. Testing chemicals before they go into products is common sense. And as Dr. Herbert so eloquently outlined, the portion of neurodevelopmental harm that's linked to toxic chemicals is preventable. The Safe Chemicals Act can help us turn the tide on autism for millions of children and families now and into the future. So with that, I'll close and hope we have time for some questions.
Thank you, Maureen, and I'm sorry, I know it was limited time for both of our speakers today, and you have so much more to share. I just want to ask real quickly if our speakers can stay on the line a little bit over, or if you have another engagement.
I can stay on another 10 minutes.
Okay, sure. So I'm going to make my next statement really, really quick, and then we'll get on to the questions. I just want to mention now that if you're an Alaskan resident, please contact Senators Mark Begich and Lisa Murkowski to ask both of them to co-sponsor the Safe Chemicals Act that Senator Lautenberg will be reintroducing in the next few weeks. And we also want to acknowledge the fine work of one of our community partners, the Arc of Anchorage, a not-for-profit organization dedicated to serving those children and adults with disabilities lead fulfilling lives in our community. And the Arc of Anchorage was founded in 1957 by a small group of parents at the very beginning of a nationwide shift in how our society thinks about people with disabilities. This group of parents came together to fight for the rights of their children with disabilities, and the Arc of Anchorage became engaged in the work to change chemicals policy on a state and national level because it makes sense to prevent disabilities by eliminating their causes if we can. They've provided testimony in letters in support of state legislation to phase out harmful flame retardant chemicals and urged our senators to co-sponsor the Safe Chemicals Act. So thank you to the Arc of Anchorage for all that you do. Again, I'd like to thank our speakers and everybody for joining us, and we would now like to open the lines for a question. We'll probably just have time for one, maybe two. Since I'd like to invite those calling from Alaska to ask a question first, just because we're so short on time. And if you'd like to ask a question, please press *2 to unmute your line. Please state your name and affiliation and try to be brief. Thank you. I don't hear anybody out there.
Well, I'm from Ottawa.
No, we'd like to take a question. We'd like to take a question from Alaska, please.
Yeah. Okay, I'm waiting for the Alaskan people there. If it makes any difference, we're from the Canadian Arctic.
*2 to unmute.
Oh, wait.
I can barely.
Hi. Hello,
Hello,
Diana.
I think I hear somebody. Yes.
Yeah, hi. had a question for our speakers. This is Pam from ACAT. I'd like to just hear more, maybe in closing remarks from our two speakers, about, Dr. Herbert, you talked about kind of preventative measures for parents to be and how to build resiliency on an individual basis. And I wondered if perhaps the speakers could close maybe by talking a little bit about how we can build resiliency not only on an individual level, but also on a societal level. And I know reforming the Toxic Substances Control Act is one thing, but if you have any additional thoughts, it would be really helpful to hear. Thank you so much.
This is Martha Herbert. I'll just make it in a couple of sentences. Getting rid of toxicant exposures is fantastically important. Getting the agriculture system so that it really produces an abundance of nutrient-dense food and not so much processed food, pesticide-laden food, GMO food, and high fructose corn syrup type things would be great. Those and even in this situation of economic downturn, getting more people back into farming. The reason we have so few farmers is not really about the well-being of society. It's really for other reasons, or the well-being of our health. So in terms of social policy, that's what I would say.
This is Maureen. I would definitely echo and defer to Dr. Herbert. And LDA has recently been holding some forums and doing some work on the nutrition aspect. And so absolutely, we support efforts and on a personal level and policy level to eliminate. Well, not eliminate, but to reduce the use of high fructose corn syrup, food dyes and additives. Those are all things to avoid for all of us and for our children, and to move away from processed foods and toward whole foods. That's essential.
Thank you, Maureen. Thank you again to both of our speakers, Dr. Herbert, for your incredible research and emerging science, and Maureen for all of your policy work, and all of you for joining us today. I'd like to remind everyone that a recording of this call will be available on our website. And if you value these calls, please consider making a donation to Alaska Community Action on Toxics via our secure website at akaction.org. If you have any further questions or would like to suggest a topic or contact us, you can do so at 907-222-7714, or you can email me at Diana with one N at akaction.org. And thanks again to everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The moderator has disconnected. The call will now end.